Chomsky. I'm a retired professor at MIT Department of Linguistics and Philosophy. I guess the most commendable thing he's done is not decide, to bomb Iran or something. I can think of things he hasn't done, and it's commendable that he hasn't done them, but you can point to very little that, at least by my standards, is commendable. I mean, he's retracted some of the more extreme Bush positions. So, for example, say on Cuba, Bush imposed the normal conditions are totally outlandish and ridiculous, which is why everyone except Israel votes against them at the UN and why the majority of Americans object to them. But Bush went way beyond. He imposed even harsher conditions, and Obama withdrew some of those. On nuclear issues, he has indicated that the U.S. should return to the mainstream of international affairs, consider again the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, move towards reducing nuclear weapons. Okay, that's a step forward from Bush's position, but it's a step towards the center and towards the international mainstream and also towards American public opinion. And there are a number of other cases like that where the Bush administration, especially its first term, was quite extreme, which is why the U.S. standing in the world fell to historic lows. Nothing much, because I never expected anything. I was a little surprised by the fact that he reinstituted some of the judicial practices that were kind of unconscionable that Bush made use of, like he wants preventive detention permanently. He's been waffling about torture. He's refusing to grant normal criminal trials to people that they have no evidence against. They claim to have none. Things like that have been a little surprising. I don't think he had to be that extreme in his interpretation of actually deviation from any reasonable legal system. American democracy is what we call a guided democracy in countries that we don't like Iran. So in Iran, elections are, putting aside questions of the credibility of elections, the candidates are vetted by the leadership, the clerical leadership. Guardian Council decides who can run. Okay, we're pretty much the same. Here, candidates are vetted by corporate interests. And the way it's done is that unless you have huge corporate financing and support, you just can't run. I mean, Obama won over McCain primarily because the financial institutions liked him better, so poured money into his campaign much more than McCain. And if you check funding and polls, you find that the advertising and so on, in fact, carried him over the edge. And that's true all the way along. I mean, elections are basically bought. Congress, for example, has very low ranking among the population. It's in the teens sometimes. Nevertheless, the overwhelming majority of incumbents win. What does that tell you? It tells you people are voting for candidates that they don't like because they don't have any choice. These are fundamental defects in the democratic system. It's a huge democratic deficit, as it's called, and it shows up. There's a very sharp division between public policy and public attitudes on a host of major issues. In fact, both political parties are well to the right of the population on a great number of critical issues, and the population feels it can't do anything about it. So, for example, last polls I saw about this, about 80% of the population said the government doesn't work for the people, it works for a few big interests looking out for themselves. Well, that's 80% of the population. But if you had asked the next question, they didn't do it, well, what are you going to do about it? People probably would have said, well, I can't do anything. There's no way to do anything about the fact that the government's in the pockets of the rich and a few big interests, corporate interests primarily. That feeling of helplessness, impotence, everything's run by somebody else, I can't do anything about it, that reflects a democratic deficit. These are enormous problems with the way the democratic system functions. I mean, there's something similar in most places, but the United States is pretty extreme in this regard among the industrial democracies. The American elites, this goes back to the Constitutional Convention, have been very concerned that over what's sometimes called an excess of democracy, that is real participation by the public in formulating policy. In fact, the constitutional system was designed to prevent that. Madison's conception was that what he called the wealth of the nation, the responsible set of men, they're the ones who should set policy. That's why the Senate, which represented the wealthy, was given most of the power in the constitutional system, least responsive to the public, more consisting of wealth. And there have been battles about this all through American history, and of course things have changed a lot since the Constitutional Convention, but the basic theme remains the same. So for example, the leading public intellectual of the 20th century, Walter Lippmann, was progressive, Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy, progressive. His view, he wrote what are called progressive essays on democracy, very influential, and his view was that the public should be spectators, not participants, and that what he called the responsible people like him, the ones who make policy, they should be insulated from the public. As he put it, they ought to be protected from the trampling and the roar of the bewildered herd, the general public, ignorant and meddlesome outsiders who don't belong in the political system. That's a very standard view. I mean, this is a version from the progressive sector, but it extends pretty much across the spectrum. That's why there was an outburst of democratic participation in the 1960s. In fact, it significantly civilized the society. But it caused enormous concern among elites. There was a major study called The Crisis of Democracy by relatively liberal elites. Basically, for example, the Carter administration was drawn from their ranks, that sector, internationally. And they were concerned about the excess of democracy, too much participation. It's an overload on the state. You can't have all these so-called special interests pressing their own demands. Who are the special interests? It's minorities, women, the young, the old, farmers, workers, in fact the population. They're the special interests. Then there's the national interest, which has to be sustained. And that's the interest of the one sector that they don't mention, namely concentrated private capital, which is overwhelming in its influence, but they represent the national interest, so it's okay. In fact, Madison had rather similar ideas. That's a leading conception of social and political thought. And there's a lot of effort put into instigating it. That's what propaganda is about. We don't call it propaganda, but what appears in the media and the schools and so on, and you can see its effects. In a democracy, April 15th, when you pay your taxes, would be a day of celebration. Here we've gotten together as a community, we've decided on certain policies, and now we're moving to implement them by our own participation. Well, that's not the way it's viewed in the United States. It's a day of mourning. There's this alien entity, sort of like as if it's from Mars somewhere, which is stealing our hard-earned money from us. and we have to give it up because we have no choice. Well, that reflects the undermining of even a conception of democracy. There's a lot of concern about the cost of U.S. health care, which makes good sense. I mean, it's going to tank the economy. There's about twice as much per capita as comparable countries, has some of the worst outcomes, and it's growing pretty fast. So yeah, it's a real problem. And a lot of criticism of Obama's plan from the right, as it's called, is that it's too expensive. Well, there's some pretty easy ways to cut down the expense. For example, the United States is the only industrial country that by law does not permit the government to use its purchasing power to negotiate drug prices. One effect is that drug prices are way higher than anywhere else. Well, what does the public think about this? The few polls there are show that approximately 85% of the public thinks we ought to do it. It's not even on the agenda. In fact, a week or so ago, the New York Times had a front page article saying that Obama had made a secret deal with the drug companies in which he assured them that there would be no such moves. The government is continuing the process of effectively dismantling the productive core of the American economy, like the automobile industry. That's part of the general financialization, the shift of power to finance, to Wall Street, that's been going on for about 30 years. So it's not being destroyed, it's just domestically being destroyed. Maybe the same corporations will produce abroad. Well, that's happening right now. It's causing a disaster in places like Michigan and Ohio and Indiana. It's destroying homes, families, communities. Meanwhile, while this is happening, Obama's Secretary of Transportation is in Europe, visiting Spain, trying to work out contracts whereby, say, Spain can use federal stimulus money, taxpayer money, to provide the infrastructure and the technology and the equipment for high-speed rail transport, which we desperately need. I mean, if the world's going to survive, we're going to have to get off the commitment to very wasteful use of fossil fuels. That's a state corporate social engineering project that began in the 1940s, and it's leading right to disaster. So you have to redo, the society is going to have to be reconstructed massively, and one crucial part of it is high-speed transit. Well, okay, here we have the government and the corporate sector dismantling the sector of the industrial apparatus that could very well produce high-speed transit. I mean, the automobile industry could be retooled for high-speed transit. Much more radical steps have been taken. So during the Second World War, the industry was almost totally converted to war production in a kind of a semi-command economy. It was very successful. American industrial production almost quadrupled. It could surely be done here. But instead of doing that, which would make sense for the population and for our grandchildren, it would help preserve a livable environment. Instead of doing that, Obama is sending his transportation secretary to use taxpayer money to get the Spanish to do it for us. I mean, as a commentary on the social and economic system, this is just devastating. Have you seen a comment about it anywhere? No, because it's in the interests of the sectors, the few big interests that in fact do run the country. By now, mostly the financial sector. It's profitable for them. So what the public wants, we don't even know what the public wants because they're not even asked. It's so remote from consciousness. But I suspect that people would support it, and it certainly could be done. As in most sciences, especially the human sciences, almost every major question is open. So for example, take the question of the two obvious questions. One is, how come there are any languages at all? I mean, A second question is, why are there apparently so many? These are pretty elementary questions, but they're sensible questions. Roughly, say, 100,000 years ago, which is almost nothing in evolutionary time, the questions couldn't be raised because there weren't any languages. Maybe 200,000, but roughly that area. So it's a sensible question. One is the question, how did languages suddenly emerge in the evolutionary record? And it's pretty sudden in evolutionary framework, the amount of time involved. And then how come they proliferated? How come there isn't just one? Well, there's steps towards answering that. There's progress, I think. My own view, I should say, is pretty idiosyncratic. It's not widely held. But I think we understand enough about the fundamental computational basis of language to see that to develop a kind of a plausible scenario for how there might have been a reasonably sudden emergence of the fundamental nature of language, and also of why the apparent diversity is pretty superficial. So that if, say, a Martian was looking at humans the way we look at, say, frogs, the Martian might conclude that there's fundamentally one language with minor deviations. And I think we're moving towards an understanding of how that might be the case, and it is pretty clear that it has to be the case. The time of development is much too shallow for fundamental changes to have taken place. And we know of no fundamental changes. So a child from a hunter-gatherer tribe and Stone Age tribe in, say, the Amazon, brought to Cambridge and raised here will go on and become a quantum physicist at MIT. There's no known differences in relevant cognitive capacities. So there's something fundamentally the same about all of us, and it's whatever emerged pretty recently. And we have to work out to show that the enormous apparent variety is a kind of superficial variation, and also to explain how it might have suddenly appeared in the evolutionary record. I just know it has an unbreakable grip, but I can't tell you what it is. It's just life's empty without it. I have to say, the people who really impress me when I have a chance to meet them are people whose names nobody will ever hear. So, for example, in well, let me give you a very personal example. A couple of months ago, I learned that extremely poor peasants in southern Colombia, whose lives are being destroyed in part by US-run chemical warfare called fumigation, which destroys their agricultural lands and communities, and in part just by the terror of the Colombian state and the, by now, terror of the guerrillas that they're caught in the middle of. Really miserable people. They just planted a forest in memory of my wife, who died a couple of months ago. That's one of the most moving things I've ever experienced. I've actually met some of them. I did go down but couldn't do anything for them. I just listened to horrible testimonies. But these are people with real, and they're all over the world, with real human feelings, commitment, concern, suffering beyond what we can imagine, but willing to do something for someone else they've never met. And you find things like that all over the place, here too. Some of the most moving experiences I've had are just in black churches in the South during the Civil Rights Movement, where people were getting beaten, killed, really struggling for the most elementary rights, just asking for the congressional amendments during the Civil War, asking them to be implemented. Not particularly radical, but quite a battle. And continues like that. These are the really impressive people, in my view. There are fundamental questions that are arising all the time, like how do I distribute my work and energy and effort? Every minute of the day you have to face such questions. Sometimes I wouldn't exactly call it an ethical dilemma, but although I guess it is. I mean, so for example, in the early 60s, I had to make a really hard decision. Should I start becoming really active instead of just talking in critical human issues that were arising then? The war in Vietnam, the growing war in Vietnam, the civil rights movement, many others. So should I become really active in those, or should I devote my time and energy to very exciting intellectual work and to my growing family? I had little children. Well, that's a hard decision. I knew perfectly well that you can't just put your foot in it and walk away. If you get started, it's a growing commitment. And my wife and I had to work that out in some fashion. It was not simple. In fact, at one point, she actually had to go back to college after 17 years because it looked as though I might serve a long prison sentence. We had 3 kids to take care of. Well, there's decisions. That's a serious decision, but there are lots of others all the time. There are fundamental questions that are arising all the time, like how do I distribute my work and energy and effort? Every minute of the day you have to face such questions. Sometimes I wouldn't exactly call it an ethical dilemma, but although I guess it is. I mean, so for example, in the early 60s, I had to make a really hard decision. Should I start becoming really active instead of just talking in critical human issues that were arising then? The war in Vietnam, the growing war in Vietnam, civil rights movement, many others. So should I become really active in those, or should I devote my time and energy to very exciting intellectual work and to my growing family? I had little children. Well, that's a hard decision. I knew perfectly well that you can't just put your foot in it and walk away. If you get started, it's a growing commitment. And my wife and I had to work that out in some fashion. It was not simple. In fact, at one point, she actually had to go back to college after 17 years because it looked as though I might serve a long prison sentence. We had 3 kids to take care of. Well, there's decisions. That's a serious decision, but there are lots of others all the time.